All study is an exercise in definition. In studying being, we seek to define it. But what exactly do we do when defining? To answer this question, let us turn to the hub of definitions, the dictionary, and consider a random example, say, the definition of orange. One definition returned by Google search reads, a large, round, juicy citrus fruit with a tough, bright, reddish yellow rind. Notice then that to define an orange, we have to appeal to a class of objects called fruit, to which orange belongs, but which contains other objects that are not oranges. Therefore, to define orange, we must appeal to objects that are not oranges. Or more formally, to define orange, we have to appeal to not orange. From this, we can formulate one rule of definition, that an object is defined by another. The fact that there is another to the object being defined implies that it is finite. That is, it occupies a limited region on the ontological landscape, allowing that there is a region beyond it where another can occupy. We can therefore formulate a second rule of definition, that definition implies finitude. Notice then that fruit is a class of objects related to orange. Therefore, we can formulate a third rule of definition, that an object is defined by another by establishing its relationship to the other. Then, notice that the only way this definition is satisfactory to an inquirer is if they already know what fruit means. Fruit has to be clearly defined in the inquirer's mind to act as a reference point against which orange can be defined. From this, we can formulate a fourth rule of definition, that an object is defined by another by establishing its relationship to the other, which other acts as a credible reference point by itself being definite. Definition therefore requires a plurality of objects, say A and C, with the one C being defined by the other A, where A could be rendered as a set of objects related to C. In short, A defines C. But then, to be a credible reference point for C, A must itself be defined. Applying the first rule of definition to A, it is then required that A is defined by another. But then that other that defines A must itself also be defined, requiring still another definer. Carrying this logic through, we see that we require an infinite regression of definers for actual definition to be possible. We then end up with two possibilities. Firstly, we could grant that A, because only finite objects are defined, and B, because definition requires an infinite regression of definers and therefore of defined finite objects, and C, because it is not possible to access an ultimate definer at the end of an infinite regression of finite objects. Therefore, D, definition does not exist, since there is no ultimate definer. Alternatively, we could grant that A, because only finite objects are defined, and B, because definition requires an infinite regression of definers and therefore of defined finite objects, and C, because definition exists in our experience, then D, there is in fact an ultimate definer, which is both accessible and relatable to finitude, and yet spans to the end of an infinite regression of defined finite objects. That is, the ultimate definer is itself a set of an infinite number of defined finite objects. Since we are in the business of defining, we will choose the second possibility, for it is the only way we can reasonably carry on our task. We grant then that there is an ultimate definer A, which is the set n1, n2, n3 up to n infinity, such that n1 is defined by n2, which is defined by n3, etc. Or to rephrase A, the ultimate definer is infinite. Reapplying the first and third rules of definition to the ultimate definer, we reason that 1. The ultimate definer is definite, therefore 2. The ultimate definer is defined by another. But then there is no other, since the ultimate definer, being infinite, is all-encompassing. Therefore, 3. The ultimate definer is another and yet the same. That is, A is a community of being, one and yet many. We will use the notation A equals a two-term vertical array in parentheses, with the terms being 1 and n, the same way you will write 1 over n but without the over, which we will read as A is 1 and n in singularity, or A is as much 1 as n at the same time, where n is any finite quantity, in this case a quantity other than 1. The ultimate definer revealed as a community of being, is the identity of the biblical God. Notice then that the very first word for God in Genesis 1:1 is the Hebrew word Elohim, a plural form of the word Eloah, which means Lord. Notice also how God speaks in Genesis chapter 1 verse 26 and 27. Then God said, "Let us make man in our image, after our likeness." So God created man in his own image. In the image of God he created him, male and female he created them. Notice then that God addresses himself in the plural form as us, whilst at the same time being referred to with singular pronouns and verbs, for God is one and God is many. In this way, God, that is infinity, can be self-defining, since it is self-referencing, being other than itself. Therefore it is written in Exodus chapter 3 verse 14, God said to Moses, "I am who I am." And he said, "Say this to the people of Israel, I am has sent me to you." For the being of God is entirely predicated on himself. Consider then the uniqueness of the God of the Bible as understood specifically in Christianity. Whereas God in other religions is either a monist God, an isolated person like the God of Islam, or a panel of gods often jostling for position like the gods of the Greeks and the Hindus, the one true God, whose nature is consistent with logic, is the God of the Bible, one and yet many, many and yet one. Again, applying the third rule of definition to God, we reason that God is self-relating, which is the definition of God's personality. This is why the Bible speaks of God as He and not it, but we will revisit this subject in greater detail later. Applying the second rule of definition to God, we reason that God will manifest as a finite object. But then we have just defined God as infinity. We reason then that God will be discoverable both in infinite and finite forms. Consider then that an instance of infinity is both unique and yet undifferentiated from other instances of infinity. That is, given two infinities which are not the same, then they are the same. Since given infinity 1 is greater than infinity 2 by the factor n, where n is any positive finite quantity, then infinity 1 is equal to infinity 2. We can state this feature of infinity as there is only one instance of infinity, even if there are many. Therefore, it is written in Deuteronomy chapter 6 verse 4, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one." Conversely, a peculiar finite quantity n is differentiated from all other finite quantities and unique only, since n times n is not equal to n except for n equals 1. We anticipate then that God will manifest in finite form as a singular instance of a peculiar finite object among other finite objects. We will have to wait to delve into theology properly to discuss what this object is.